you don't know me, I'm Jessica. I'm working in Dr. Thea's lab for my master's in the Wildlife and Fisheries Biology program. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Jim Anderson. He is our speaker today. He is at the James C. Kennedy Endowed Professor of Waterfowl and Wetland Ecology. He's the director of the James C. Kennedy Waterfowl and Wetland Center and a faculty member in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation here at Clemson. Prior to Clemson, he was a professor of wildlife and fisheries resources and the Davis Michael Professor of Forestry and Natural Resources at West Virginia University. His research centers on ecology of wetland and riparian systems and wetland-dependent wildlife. He earned a bachelor's in wildlife from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and a master's in range and wildlife management through the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University-Kingsville, and a doctorate in wildlife science from Texas Tech University. And in his spare time, he likes to garden, hunt, and go on adventures with his wife, Heather, and their Labrador retriever, Gideon. So without further ado, here's Dr. Anderson to speak on If We Build It, Will They Come? Responsive biota to wetland mitigation in the Central Appalachians.
Great, thank you for that nice introduction, Jessica. And happy to be here today. So yeah, I want to talk about some of the work we've done over the past 20 years or so in West Virginia on wetland mitigation. And so today I'm just going to focus on a few of the studies. I'm going to give you some background, try to set it up because I know not everybody's a wetland person or understands wetland mitigation policy. So we'll cover some of the basics and then talk a little bit about some of these particular projects. So let's start out with wetlands. So wetlands are these kind of transitional areas between terrestrial and aquatic systems. So usually we think about water table on the surface, but it doesn't necessarily have to be water on the table, or water on the surface. So it could be shallow water, it could be close to the surface. Generally, we think about within 12 inches of that surface, so subsurface type of water, we'd still have a wetland area. But most of us are familiar with water being on the surface in terms of a wetland system. And so we think about wetlands from a jurisdictional standpoint, and we talk about the three parameter approach. And so the first parameter is the hydrophytes or hydrophytic vegetation, water-loving plants. So at least periodically, the land supports predominantly hydrophytes or vegetation. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but when we think about these types of things by, periodically, basically meaning most years, 3 out of, 5 years type of thing. Predominantly hydrophytes, we're talking about, again, like 51% or more of the surface being covered by vegetation. And so there's these specific definitions, which we're not going to worry about today, but just know that it's more in depth, I guess, than what I am presenting here. So we have these hydrophytes or hydrophytic vegetation. We have predominantly undrained hydric soil, and hydric soil has unique characteristics which develop due to low oxygen or anoxic conditions, which generally change the color of our soils. And then the third component is water or hydrology. So again, maybe it's covered by shallow water at some time during the growing season. And pretty much all these definitions talk about growing season, so that's pretty important. Or again, it could just be near the surface. So that's hydrology. So we put these together. We have hydrology, we have hydric soil, and we have hydrophytic vegetation. And then we develop a wetland as we see here. And I want to point this out. This is a typical wetland in the Appalachians, West Virginia. Not necessarily the greatest from a wildlife habitat perspective. But then one thing I want to point out is you see kind of this rusty water. We see that quite a bit. So there's a lot of acid mine drainage within the state. And so a lot of the wetlands are going to be impacted by this type of condition. We look across the globe, we think about wetland abundance. So 1999, based on the Ramsar definition, which is pretty broad. So basically they include all wetlands, which are less than 6 meters in depth, which most wetland ecologists don't necessarily consider something that's several meters deep as being a wetland. But based on this broad definition, they come up with 1.2 million kilometers square of wetlands. Okay, but again, if we look at the distribution, you can see where they are across the world. And North America, has 242 million hectares of wetlands. But again, that's a pretty broad definition. When we look at a more traditional definition of wetlands, we think about across the world, roughly 330 million hectares of wetlands. In 1997, by 2011, that decreased to 188 million hectares, which was a 43% decrease. So we continue to lose wetlands. And so historically, we've lost somewhere north of about 60% of our wetlands. I forgot to mention as well that I am happy to address questions as we go through this. So if you do have questions, just interrupt or send a chat or whatever, and we can answer those. So why do we lose wetlands? Well, we think about wetland draining, filling, diking, damming, construction, and development. And really, it all comes down to that last thing, right? Construction and development. We continue to grow as a human population, and as we do, we need infrastructure like houses and roads in order to agriculture in order to survive. And so we drain and fill wetlands, and we continue to lose these important systems. We look back historically. So I got a couple of pictures here from Biebighauser's book on wetland losses and wetland restoration. And here is showing horses where they use these basically these V-shaped ditches to drain lands for agricultural use. And this was pretty common. And again, continues to be done. And it doesn't take much to drive across the landscape pretty much anywhere, and you can see evidence of these wetland losses in wetland drainage. There's been all kinds of pipes and terracotta pipe, and now all the way up to the plastics that are being used. And so we'll see that again, and you can find evidence of this sort of thing in lots of wetland areas. And that's important when we start thinking about wetland restoration, because it's easier to restore these wetlands like this that have been tile drained often than thinking about developing a new wetland from an upland area or from an aquatic area. Here's another picture from Biebighauser's book. This, I think, was out of Kentucky. And all these lines here are wetland drainage. And this was done, I think, back in the 1950s when they could still have a lot of fun. They put dynamite out here and they basically blew up these lines to basically drain the land for agriculture. All right, so a lot of evidence out there of wetland loss. So why do we lose wetlands? Well, we talked about all the components as it relates to development, but then they also, wetlands, just have this derogatory, thoughts about them. Well, some real, like, right, we get malaria and stuff from mosquitoes, and so nobody really enjoys mosquitoes, and we can get those from wetlands and lots of diseases that stem from that. But then also, there's folklore about, the bog creature and the boogeyman and things like that we think about in terms of wetlands. And so they have this negative connotation. And even just thinking about, terminology, I'm swamped at work, right? I'm getting bogged down in all the details. I mean, those are, wetland terminology types of things that we can think about, and again, have negative connotations. Or I guess more recently, the whole let's drain the swamp, right? So negative connotations. But we know that wetlands are important, right? And so they provide numerous ecosystem services, and these ecosystem services are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. And this is a general diagram here of ecosystem services, but we can think about a lot of these things in terms of wetlands or other ecosystems. So some specific wetland ecosystem services. We can put them into four major categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting, and then a number of subcategories. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of these just to give you an idea of the types of things that we think about. And so think about fresh water as a provisioning resource. Drinking water from wetlands across the world provides water for about 1.5 to 3 million people annually. About 40% of the industrial use of water comes from wetlands, and 20% of the irrigation use comes from wetland systems. So we use these wetlands, right, a lot for our fresh water for drinking, as well as for industrial and agricultural uses. We think about water purification, which is again a regulating type of service, and we develop wetlands, and specifically to constructed wetlands to go ahead and clean some of these, right? And so here's a diagram of a free water surface constructed wetland, and these are pretty typical, right? You have water coming in, it's flowing through some porous medium, you have your vegetation, your aquatic plants, and generally you're thinking about cattails and rushes and things that have a lot of biomass that can be sometimes harvested and removed in order to help facilitate the removal of different types of nitrogen, phosphorus, different types of elements from the wetland water. We can also think about education, right? And so from a cultural perspective, we go out, we use wetlands. Obviously, most of us in this field, it's pretty second nature going out to a wetland. We're candling eggs, or we're looking at hydric soil. But there's also lots of cultures that depend on wetland systems for their food, and they live in those systems. So extremely important when we think about wetlands across the world. And then biodiversity, which again, most of us I think are pretty familiar with, but about 50% of 200 turtles globally are threatened. About 41% of over 1,000 waterbird species are in decline. Amphibians, greater than 30% of almost 2,000 amphibians are threatened with extinction, many of those associated with wetlands, and then 30% of wetland-dependent mammals are globally threatened, right? So we have, again, lots of biodiversity that depend on these, and this, of course, if we're losing more than 60% of our wetlands, of course, these things are going to have been declining. This is a little diagram showing ecosystem services in a coastal wetland, and a couple points here. So there's roughly 20-25 ecosystem services that we think about in wetlands, and not every wetland is going to provide all of those ecosystem services, and not every wetland type is going to provide equally in terms of those services. But think about coastal wetland systems, right? Well, they're great nursery areas for recreational fishing. They do provide lots of resources for tourism, wildlife recreation, whether it's hunting or angling, those sorts of things. They help us with storm surges and protect coastal communities from flooding. Lots of things like that we often think about. But water quality, while some, it might not be as much as something that's going to be in a more inland situation. Well, a lot of people have taken these ecosystem services, right, convert them to dollars. And so Costanza basically converted ecosystem services for wetlands and other systems to dollars per hectare per year. This is based on 2007 value of the US dollar. Coastal wetlands, basically $194,000 per year per hectare. So what that means is if we came up with an engineered solution, right, it would cost us roughly $194,000 to provide those same ecosystem services that wetlands are naturally providing, and that's on an annual basis. Inland wetlands, greater than $25,000 per year. And then to provide a little context, they gave you a couple other values. Coral reefs, way up there, $350,000 per year. Open ocean, less than $500 per year. And woodlands, about $1,500 per hectare per year. All right, so because we've continued to lose wetlands, and because we know wetlands are important, the US has developed this compensatory mitigation proposal. And basically what this program does is says we should have no net loss. And the no net loss is really referring to function, no net loss of wetland function. But in reality, we often are using area because we still are trying to develop all these functional metrics and trying to figure out what our function is. And so we do wetland mitigation to offset unavoidable loss to natural wetlands. And so unavoidable is something that's generally in the public good. So if we're going to build a highway, right? We can put a highway from point A to point B. We're going to cross some streams, we're going to cross some wetlands. And so the first thing is, well, can we move it to avoid those streams and wetlands? If we can't, then we say, okay, those are unavoidable. And then we have to mitigate for that. If it's something like you're going to put in a garage on your property, and you could easily put the garage on the other side, not in a wetland, right? Most likely they're not going to let you fill in that wetland because that is an avoidable loss. All right, so when we think about wetland mitigation, we think about wetland creation, restoration, and potentially preservation, but creation and restoration are the two that are used most often. And nowadays, mostly we think about mitigation banking for streams and wetlands. In mitigation banking, basically we go in ahead of time and we create those wetlands prior to their destruction. That way they have a chance to develop. All right, so we think about wetland restoration. We're talking about returning a degraded wetland or former wetland to a pre-existing condition or as close to that condition as is possible. Wetland creation is converting a non-wetland, either dry land or unvegetated water, to a wetland, so an aquatic system. And so we think about two basic approaches. So a passive approach might be something as simple as we can go ahead and put a fence around a wetland and keep cattle off of it, allow the vegetation to regrow, allow the soil to recover, and we can restore the wetland that way. Active restoration generally involves some type of earth moving, where we bring in equipment and we do something much more drastic. So I'm going to talk about some of our work in West Virginia. And so here's West Virginia, so South Carolina. All these green dots on here are wetlands that are 5 or more acres across the state. West Virginia varies quite drastically, actually, in terms of rainfall, elevation. Elevation, you see anywhere from 75 meters up to over 1,400 meters. It's primarily forested. And so those of you familiar with the state of West Virginia go, yeah, there's not much wetlands there, and there isn't. Only about 2% of the landscape is wetlands, but we do have a number of wetland systems across the state, as you saw in that previous map. Wanted to show you some pretty pictures, being that we're getting to fall and all, so it's nice to see some color. But again, not conducive to a lot of wetland systems, right? Because they have that rugged topography. You basically end up with a narrow stream at the bottom of the mountains. So you have some small wetlands there. We have some steep wetlands on the hillsides, right? But few areas where wetlands can develop. And where those wetlands have developed, we basically have lost those wetlands, right? And so again, like showing pretty pictures of what's going on, but we do have some nice wetlands. So this is Canaan Valley National Wildlife Refuge, nice fall picture. And we see some bigger wetlands developed there. This is one of our major wetland areas in the state. These are our natural wetlands. This is a created wetland near Morgantown, West Virginia, right? And so again, we have some open water areas, we have created wetlands, we have natural wetlands. When we think about wetland loss, the reports are right now about 25% of the state's wetlands have been lost, but based on some new work that we've been working on with DEP, West Virginia DEP, that number may actually be closer to 90%, about 89% of wetlands having been lost. And a lot of that is due to mining. Coal mining is a big issue in the state, declined compared to the past, but it continues to be a source of wetland loss. So I want to do a little case study here on a place called Pleasant Creek Wetland. And so this was in 2013, July 2013, started doing some earth moving work. August 2013, so a month later, we already see quite a bit of water in that wetland. And so they went out there with bulldozers and backhoes and started digging. And why were they digging? Well, remember these tile drain pipes I showed before? Well, you could again see those in that wetland. You can see these lines, all right, because even when they put them in, eventually it depresses a little bit due to the soil compaction. And so you can tell where the lines are. And so you need to get down, you need to get below these, dig these out. So you basically are trying to restore that hydrology. They do some contouring of the dikes and the berms around there. You have somebody on site the entire time. So you can try to do an actual design. Sometimes it doesn't always work. And this is one that, like many, didn't quite work exactly as anticipated. Right, it started to rain as soon as they started to build it, and it flooded up before they could finish all the contouring what they wanted to do. Here we just see a cover crop, so they plant native seeds. They put in a cover crop to keep the soil from eroding. This again 1 month afterwards. They put in some coarse woody debris, put in some old stumps and things like that to provide some wildlife habitat and a little bit more diversity. This particular wetland has a water control structure. Most of the mitigated wetlands across the state do not have any water control structures, but since this was on a wildlife management area, we wanted to control the water, try to do some moist soil management in these wetlands. Most of the time, if it's like a division of highways or something like that, they prefer not to have any type of control structure. They want to create the wetland, monitor it for their 5 years, and then walk away from it and let it do its thing. So here's a year later. You can see a lot more vegetation growth. Water has come down. Things are stabilizing, and should have gotten more recent pictures, but it's continued to develop over time. Here's an aerial photo of this. So it's actually off of a railroad grade that goes across. But this is the wetland that was created in 2013. It's a couple acres in size. Here's a road, and on this side, there's a larger wetland, about 20 acres in size, created in 2001, I believe. This also was created due to mitigation requirements for coal mining. So both of these were created due to mitigation needs from coal mining. So this was a undergraduate research project. Hannah Klipp was an undergraduate scholar, and just had her do some bird surveys out there and whatnot. And she actually is just about finished up with her PhD now. So these, internship experiences as an undergrad, work experiences can carry over and really help out in terms of getting into graduate school. So primary waterfowl species or waterbird species overall were wood ducks and mallards. And she just did basically weekly counts and monitored over time between the wetland from 2001 to 2013. Some really basic, simple types of things, but we could compare those wetlands, see what happened over time, and got some good experience for her in terms of research as well as the publication process. And so when we think about all these, wetland parameters and what can be measured, there's all sorts of things that we've looked at: vegetation, soil hydrology, water quality, presence of wildlife, right? And so those are not necessarily function; those are structural parameters. But oftentimes that's kind of what we're stuck with, are these structural parameters, and then we try to figure out some function as we move through the process. And so waterbird use, could be a function, right? But you really want to think about breeding, and then we want to think about reproduction, and then we want to think about recruitment, right? That's really kind of the end measure of a biota, wetland biota, in terms of function. Are we getting recruitment? Okay, but it's much more difficult to get that for a lot of these species than just actual count data. So I want to go back to one of our first studies that we've did in the state, 11 mitigated wetland sites that were at least 5 years of age, average 10 years of age, 3 to 10 hectares in size. The thing I want to point out, and this was pretty common with these older mitigated wetland sites, see how much open water, I mean, particularly like this, it's almost a lake, right? It's supposed to be a wetland site, but you end up with a lot of open water. And that was fairly common because they wanted to make sure they hit that hydrology. Remember the 3-parameter approach? But sometimes they ended up missing the hydrophytic vegetation parameter just because they had too much water. But they have gotten better over time. All right, so those are mitigated sites. Here's our natural reference wetlands. The thing with natural reference wetlands, and we've gotten better at determining our reference sites as we have developed larger databases, but nonetheless, it's hard to find pretty much any wetland that hasn't been impacted by people. Almost all the natural wetlands, or what you think about natural, if you start delving into them, you're going to see there's been excavation, there's been drainage. I mean, again, we try to drain these things over time to have our agriculture, our development, those sorts of things. Well, this particular study, Colin Balcom, he's a master's student. He looked at all sorts of critters as well as plants. And so this is basically our plant or vegetative communities. He looked at species richness of all species, as well as native species and non-native. Most of these slides are set up fairly similar, with mitigated wetlands in this kind of grayish color, the natural wetlands in the green color. And we see in general that the species richness was higher in the mitigated compared to natural wetlands. And that, you know, kind of makes sense because of the disturbance factor, if you will. Oftentimes you'll have those, you know, with disturbance, you'll have higher number of species of both native as well as non-native species. Evenness, diversity, all these kind of follow that same pattern. Weighted average is kind of interesting. And you think about weighted average is based on the wetland plant indicator species of a plant. So every plant species basically is classified from obligate a wetland plant all the way across the gradient to an obligate upland plant. And so the wetland plants have lower numbers, and so you see the weighted average in mitigated wetlands is a little bit lower, although not significantly different. But again, if we think about the amount of open water, basically what that was saying was that we had more open water species in those mitigated wetlands compared to our natural wetlands. This is based on species in space, so quadrats of wetland vegetation. And those are natural wetlands up there. Down here are our created wetlands, or the mitigated wetlands. And this is mitigation age. And so again, these were up to 20 years of age. And we did this, so these were published in 2005, but we did this study, I think 2002, 2003, somewhere right in there. And so we're looking at 20 years later. I'd like to go back and redo these same plots, because what you're seeing is that these plots here, all right, are again mitigated plots. They're close to natural wetlands. And so as the wetlands got older, the species composition looks more like natural wetlands, which makes sense. Okay, and so from a mitigation standpoint, that's great, right? That we can actually get wetlands that are starting to look like natural wetlands. But after 20 years, even you see that we're not quite there. Okay, so that's something I want to continue to look at. We look at breeding bird abundance, water birds, waterfowl, many more on the mitigated compared to natural wetlands. Again, one of these thing I want to point out is lots of open water, right? And so if we think about open water, that's exactly where they're going to go. Breeding birds, so like red-winged blackbirds, our sparrows, all those sorts of things. Much less, really no difference, right? Richness, diversity, abundance, pretty much the same between the mitigated and natural wetland sites. And again, that makes sense, being that we do have some emergent vegetation, you have some shrub vegetation growing, right? So they look relatively similar, at least in parts, even though the amount of open water is higher. Frogs and toads basically are neurons. And so these don't look like there's much difference here. It's based on transformations. This is the raw data presented here, but species richness slightly higher in the mitigated wetlands. Wisconsin index is the calling index, which we also use to get abundance. So those are highly correlated. But basically what this is if you have nobody calling, it's a 0. If you can pick out a single wood frog, for example, calling, it gets a 1, it gets a 2. If you can pick out multiple wood frogs, but still call them, or still count them like there's 5 or 7, that sort of thing. And then a full chorus, like get spring peepers up there in some of those wetlands where it's just deafening and it's making your eardrums ring, right? That gets a 3. And so you use those Wisconsin index calls as a index of abundance. And we see they were much higher they were higher in mitigated compared to natural. We've done some additional studies since this first one, using a lot of new statistical techniques, using acoustic recorders, using all sorts of techniques. We really found, even though our methods were much more advanced, we really found the same things as this initial study, which basically indicates that for the most part, things are the same, but mitigated wetlands ended up with a few more species, a little bit higher calling and abundance than some of our natural wetlands. The benthic macroinvertebrates are something I think that's kind of an anomaly when we look at all of our metrics, much higher in the natural compared to mitigated wetlands, but the standard error bars are so high. And we've continued to do work with benthic macroinvertebrates, trying to develop some indices of biotic integrity and those sorts of things for wetlands. And while they work great in the stream systems up there, they don't work so well in the wetlands, because you end up with areas of the wetland, you end up with no invertebrates at all, and then some wetlands are just teeming with invertebrates. And so still trying to tease that out. I've got a Ph.D. student up there right now that's trying to redo some of our IBI work just because of this discrepancy. And we think there's something going on there, so we're really delving into the water quality issue to see if that is making an impact in these created and natural wetlands. So relatively recently, we looked at these ASEP wetlands, which are Ag Conservation Enhancement Program, or easement program, excuse me. And so it used to be their old, like the NRCS wetland reserve programs, where they put them all underneath this ASEP program. So these are primarily agricultural land, wetlands, established from mid-90s to 2011, varied a bunch in size, mostly a freshwater emergent, forested and scrub, and you see scattered kind of throughout the state. The blue ones we had as reference, the red ones are the ASEP wetlands. We tried to pair those up as much as possible. We looked at a bunch of characteristics of those sites, and really not much different. But one difference that we did find was that there's more pasture around these ASEP wetlands, which makes sense, right? We're trying to put it into an agricultural context, so there should be more agriculture, and there's less forest, right? So compared to the reference wetlands, so nothing surprising or too impressive there. But the point is that, yeah, there are some slight differences, but really when we start looking at most of the characteristics of the wetland itself, there's really not much difference going on. The one surprising difference was that there was a difference in terms of invasive herbaceous vegetation, which we did expect to find, but we basically found it to be opposite of what we predicted. We assumed that the created wetlands on agricultural land would have a higher proportion of invasive herbaceous species, but it ended up being the opposite. There's actually less invasive herbaceous species on these created wetlands compared to the reference wetlands. So that was kind of a big surprise. But of course, it made NRCS pretty happy with the results. Again, wetland features and stressors inside, we see that the wetlands that they're creating are primarily seasonally flooded, which makes sense because those are the types of wetlands that are much easier to drain and were being drained on these agricultural lands, right? So you drain the seasonally flooded wetlands and then you can replace them with new seasonally flooded wetlands. We looked at a number of wintering songbirds, swamp sparrow, dark-eyed junco, a number of things affecting them, including wetland type, and we see slightly higher abundances in terms of occupancy on these ASEP wetlands for both species compared to reference wetland sites. We're still trying to get our turtle work published, but we caught primarily snapping turtles and painted turtles, a handful of other species as well. But basically snapping turtles, no difference between restored and reference. And painted turtles, we had more or higher numbers on restored compared to referenced wetlands. I should point out too that with the turtles, we use slightly different types of reference wetlands. We were looking more at open pond type wetlands to compare those to, because that's where you're going to find your turtles. So comparing biota communities, okay, we talked about a bunch of those studies, others that we did as well. It's valuable, but again, really not getting to that whole functional equivalency, right? So are these wetlands functioning the same? Well, biota communities are same or similar, higher or lower, right? And we showed all that, but how do we get at this function? And so one of my PhD students, Gabe Strain, he also did a bunch of Anuran work, which I didn't talk about today, but he looked at diet composition of red-spotted newts, which is this critter right here, and see if they're similar between created and natural wetlands. And he wanted to know if the newts were selecting prey similarly between the mitigated and natural wetland sites. So red-spotted newts have a fairly unique life history. All right, so they lay their eggs in the water. They develop into this larval stage with the gills. They stay in that stage, depending months, maybe even into the next year. Then they get to this red F stage. It's a terrestrial stage. They wander around on land for a few years, and this is the same critter. It turns into this. This is the adult aquatic stage, and this is what's laying the eggs. Okay, and so a lot of people, see these in the woods and see these in the ponds and don't realize those are the same critter, but they are. So pretty unique life history in terms of how much they actually do change. And so we wanted to look at this diet composition. So we used gastric lavage, which basically is a nice way of saying we made the little newts vomit up their dinner. Right, and so we flushed out their stomachs to see what they were consuming, and we also went out and sampled a bunch of invertebrates in the field. And here's Gabe out in the field, and there's Eric Miller, Dr. Petty. I think you all recognize him. And then we went out and we had 149 stomachs that were pumped. The most common thing was their skin, which they consumed their skin as they shed. About 7% of the stomachs were empty. We had more males than females, but we had a fairly good representation of both. We found 99 families and orders of invertebrates found in stomach and availability samples. 56% of those were found in the stomach. So they ate quite a few different things. And of course, it's hard to do anything when you're talking about 100 different families of things. So we pooled those down to 8 categories for analysis for presentation here. And basically, we looked at, well, what was happening. Here's our created wetlands with the red. Here's the natural with the blue. And we see more or less that same pattern, right, in terms of all over the place, but more or less similar, at least much higher, right, aquatic insects compared to crustacea, for example, and that for the most part held true. Mollusk, we see a little bit more of a difference than we do with some of the others in terms of foraging. And so we looked at mean dietary breadth, and we found basically it didn't really matter, created natural wetlands are the same, a little bit of difference between sex, but about the same. Lots of differences between months, so that's good. We knew we could actually detect differences, but there really weren't any differences happening there in terms of what they were eating. So fairly similar. We looked at some compositional analysis, and the wetland type again is what we want to focus in on. And so basically crustacea were avoided more than insecta in created wetland, but really very limited, right? So what that meant was that for the most part, they're consuming the same types of insects in both, or same types of invertebrates in both types of wetlands. So these wetlands were functioning similarly in terms of red-spotted newt diet, right? So again, a lot of things aren't different. We often think about science, right? We want to have a difference, but when we think about wetland mitigation and trying to see if they're functioning, ideally there is no difference, right? Because we want those wetlands to be functioning as similar to natural wetlands as possible. And so I think in this case, a lack of differences in a lot of these things is actually pretty good. The last, I guess, topic I wanted to cover was on spotted salamanders. So this was something more recently. Alice Milliken, Ph.D. student, I think she finished about 2 years ago, was looking at spotted salamanders in vernal pools. And again, they have, this life history stage, they're terrestrial, and then they lay their eggs, they have their aquatic stage. And they primarily develop, though, in what we think about vernal pools, so basically fishless areas. This particular study, we had trouble finding natural vernal pools, so we just focused on a variety of created vernal pools. And of course, the issue with vernal pools is they dry down, which is good because they do not allow fish to establish, which eat the eggs and the larvae, but sometimes that also means they dry down too quickly, and then you also lose the egg masses. We see the eggs here and over here, as this is just about completely dried up. And so Dr. Milliken looked at stress and corticosterone, which is basically an amphibian glucocorticoid hormone. And so it makes energy available for growth, reproduction, and it responds to unexpected stimuli in the environment. So there's this court fitness hypothesis, which basically means when you're exposed to a perceived stressor and that individual ends up with a higher level of corticosterone when it's more stressed, and it might mean they're potentially less fit. Right. And so we can measure a bunch of habitat parameters. And so, again, you think if you have poorer habitat, you would end up with higher levels of corticosterone. And so she basically looked at a number of these created vernal pools, as I indicated. And the top model included salamander total length, pool water temperature, pool diameter, and we can also see year sampled had an impact. So pool diameter had a negative association with corticosterone. And so basically what that means is that larger vernal pools are better, causing less stress. And so from a management perspective, that's easy to do. You create larger vernal pools when you're creating these. You put vernal pools closer together, right? And so you basically want to try to push that limit in terms of making these fishless, but still allowing that water to last throughout the breeding season. And so can we build wetlands to enhance biodiversity? Oh, yes, certainly. And I think we've showed that with a number of studies, continuing studies, that we can do that. But in reality, avoidance is better. because wetlands need time to develop, right? If you think back to those plots about quadrats of plants out on the landscape, the older they got, the closer they were to natural wetlands. And that was even after 20 years. So, 20 years old enough, well, not quite, 30 years, maybe 40, 50. I mean, who knows how long it takes. The other thing I think is, again, that we have gotten better at creating wetlands, right? And so that science has developed a lot since the 1990s, when it really initially took off. I mean, I know there's been wetland restoration going on for decades, but I mean, that was probably the start of a massive undertaking of wetland restoration in the United States. So if we are to conserve wetlands, we must get people excited about wetlands. And so things like snapping turtles, right, and invertebrates and stuff like that, I think makes people excited. I've done a lot of work with like wetland plant litter decomposition and mitigated wetlands. Well, show somebody, ooh, look at this bag of mesh with decomposing plants. Isn't that exciting? Well, probably not. But show them a turtle, right? And look at that kid's expression there. I mean, that's pretty impressive, right? That's what gets people excited. And I think if we can get kids excited and adults excited about stuff like this, then that's how we go about conserving wetlands. And so I thank all the funders over the past 22 years that have supported my research on wetland mitigation. And I'd be happy to address any questions you might have. So thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Anderson, thank you again for coming and for that awesome seminar. If anyone has any questions, please just unmute or put them in the chat and I'll address them.
Speechless.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. I really enjoyed your talk. And I have a question. Why do you think the NRCS folks were so surprised that all of these invasive wetland species were there in the opposite pattern that you predicted? Do you have any idea why that turned out to be?
Well, so don't know why we found that, but I mean, they were surprised, right? Because you're in a highly disturbed system when you're in those pastures and old agricultural fields. And so you would expect, right, that as you create this wetland, try to restore the hydrology, you still have that seed bank from, that's in there. And so that would respond, right? But yeah, we thought we'd have a lot more invasives out there, and so part of it might be, those numbers are still low, right? I mean, even there's only, whatever, 5% or whatever in the natural. So maybe it wasn't a big deal to begin with. So those numbers were low. But yeah, I mean, I would have expected, even before we started, trying to figure out hypotheses and whatnot. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to have a lot more disturbance tolerance plants, and you're going to end up with a lot, and which we did, but you're also going to have a lot more of these exotic invasives, which ended up not being the case. And so, so maybe part of it is the hydrology, was okay, but I'm not sure, exactly why we found that, but that was, to me, and I think to them, highly surprising.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and we do have one question in the chat. It says, do you see the water quality difference between nature and created wetland during the time?
So we've done one small study that we have looked at that, and it was like a handful of wetlands, and we did not find a study, or we did not find a difference between the natural and created wetlands. Currently, I have a PhD student that's sampling 200 wetlands across the state. Some are natural, some created. We're not necessarily addressing this question, but that's one of the questions that he will be able to address. And so I think that'll tell us, yes, indeed, if there is a difference or not. But I would suspect that water quality would be more impaired, particularly from acid mine drainage, as well as maybe fecal coliforms. And the reason I would say that is because when we do wetland mitigation, you try to do, this is excluding, let's say, mitigation banking, but when you do one-on-one wetland mitigation, which is historically what's been done the most, you try to do on-site mitigation. So basically, if you disturb a site right here, you basically want to create that wetland right next door. And so if you are creating that wetland where you just built a housing development, right? Well, you'd expect there to be potential for more water quality impairment, right? So our small study indicated really very minimal differences in terms of water quality. I expect, though, with this larger study with different objectives, but that we will see more differences with that.
All right, and we have another one from Rick Kaminsky. He said, what advice do you have to market wetland ecosystem services in general instead of mostly waterfowl to Ducks Unlimited, the professed leader in wetlands conservation?
Yeah, that's good question, Rick. Yeah, so again, we think about duck hunters, right? So, Ducks Unlimited, and I'm a big duck hunter. We like ducks. And so, I think that's enough from a duck perspective, but the majority of people do not hunt ducks, right? But we think about, again, clean water. Who does not like clean water, right? So I think those are the types of things that we need to get across to the people. But again, if we start thinking about clean water to a child, clean water, they probably don't really care. They probably prefer to have muddy water, right? To go out and play in. So, I think, again, things that get their interest. So, showing them a duck, showing them a frog, them catch a turtle. Those sorts of things, I think is going to help. But then, I think the market, and really, I think everything is market driven. And I'm not an economist by any means, but I think if we can show a market for, improved water quality. I've been working with some folks in China, and they do a lot with wetland creation as it relates to air quality, right? With the 2.5, parts per million type thing and all that. I'm not an air quality person, but they do a lot of that work there. So I think if we could figure out how, we can improve our, greenhouse gases, we can improve our air quality or water quality and make that into a tradable market, which is being done, but it hasn't developed, I don't think, as far as it needs to. I think that is going to increase that ecosystem services and that general interest in it beyond just ducks. Although, again, we all love ducks.
Hey, Jim, this is Lydia. I have a question. Sorry, my camera is not working. Yeah. I'm just wondering if, thinking about your definition of natural versus mitigated wetlands, and is there much variation for your natural wetlands in the degree of how ephemeral they are? So are some more ephemeral and some are more consistently present? And if so, does that maybe mimic some of the disturbance qualities that you might see in mitigated wetlands?
Right. Yeah. Good question. And I didn't go into great detail on that, but with each study we've done, I think we've gotten better in terms of choosing our natural reference wetlands. And so, I think our first wetlands, the first study, we only had a couple of natural wetlands, and they were more, heavily vegetated, and I think quite a bit different. We tried to, some of our later studies, for example, looking at amphibians, we tried to choose beaver ponds because they more mimic the types of wetlands that were being created with mitigated wetlands. The turtle project, we use farm ponds, right? So I mean, they were natural, but trying to have something to compare to. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that makes a huge difference in terms of the types of wetlands that are out there. We probably represented in some of those cases, like the temporarily and seasonally flooded wetlands. And I didn't talk about some of the larger studies in terms of numbers, just because we weren't specifically looking at created versus natural, even though we've kind of pulled out some of those data. But we've had a couple of studies where we've looked at, like hundreds of wetlands, and we haven't data mined all of that at this point, but those data sets I think are much more comparable in terms of the hydrologic regime between the natural and the created wetlands, just because of the sheer sample size.
Great, thank you.
Mhm. Great, anybody else?
Okay, if there's no more questions, then we can do kind of an informal discussion between everybody. So if you would like to be a part of that, then just